Hey.
The clapper. Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Are you?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Sometimes I like to accuse people as if they're not.
Sometimes I like to accuse people. Nice. So you like the Lysander Spooner better, huh?
Yes, I think. I feel a little bit bad. I felt like I came off a little harsh, especially when you made that clip. I sounded so annoying on that clip.
I just thought it was funny.
It was funny, but yeah, I even annoyed myself listening to it. I was like, oh God. But yeah, no, I mean, it's just because I think, and I had meant to. I read up on his Wikipedia, but I can't remember if he was trained as a lawyer. I'm looking up real quick. But it's just he read like he was trained as a lawyer,
yes.
And he had just a very cogent argument. And, yeah, it was just he laid out, I think, just a better argument for anarchism. Honestly.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
What's interesting is we were having kind of a my wife's sister and brother-in-law, so her husband, are in town. He does a lot of translation work, and he works for like government organizations and stuff like that. And he could not stand. He was just like, this guy is a moron.
Really?
Yeah, he was just like, this guy needs to take a writing class. I would fail him immediately.
That's hilarious. Why did he not like him?
So they both didn't like how many asides he had. Like a proper contract, comma, for it to be ethical, comma, is, comma, when discussing this, comma, like all the like layers of parenthetical expressions they just did not like at all.
Yeah, I mean, do they read much philosophy? I just feel like that's how most of this stuff reads.
I guess he reads a lot of contract and legal documents.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. I mean, I'm reading the guy's Wikipedia. I'm not seeing anything that explicitly says where he went to school, but it says he was a legal theorist, so I'm assuming he went to law school. But
well, what does it say in the little blurb about him in the actual Anarchist Handbook?
I don't know. If you want to look at that while I'm looking at the Wikipedia.
So this is Lysander Spooner we're talking about. Okay, so...
Yes.
Abolitionist and attorney, Lysander Spooner's essay, No Treason, consisted of 3 parts. It is the third part, oddly numbered as 6, that holds the most sway today. The Constitution is like a, quote, no-gun zone sign for conservatives, in that the only people it would bind are those who are already generally honest and peaceable. The ones who would lie or commit harm would simply look at the piece of paper and scoff. With unrelenting logic, Spooner dissects the sanctity of the Constitution and demonstrates that it cannot be said to have moral authority over anyone.
Right. Yeah. So, and I should say, actually, more than philosophy, the way that I read this was as like he was approaching it like a mathematical proof, which is why there were so many asides. Like, it was annoying, but it was he was just being rigorous. That's all
I guess it didn't annoy me. At first, I thought he was repeating himself, but then after a while, I was like, oh, he's not actually repeating himself. He's bringing up a slightly different angle to show how his point also fits in this situation and this situation and this situation.
Which can be cumbersome and annoying for somebody that doesn't realize what he's doing.
Right.
So you could tell them I said that. No,
no, I agree. Because I think just
and
looking at one
I'm
sentence.
Defending this guy. I don't know.
You're like, I hate this guy.
No, I mean, because I honestly don't really agree with him, but I guess
really?
I'm defending.
Yeah, of course.
I'm defending the idea, though, that he is not a terrible writer. I think he's yeah. Like, I disagree with that. But I will say that he's very repetitive. But that's why I think he was a good writer, because he was easier for me to read, even though he was 50 pages.
Right.
Like, I felt like he was easy to get through because I understood what he was doing. I understood I understood the format. Right. I don't know. I guess they didn't get it when they were reading.
I mean, they didn't read a lot of it. It was just like 2 paragraphs.
Oh, well, okay.
Mostly because I was confused about his use of is. This is a little bit silly, but like he would do a comma, is, comma. So is would be its complete own piece of a sentence, which was very confusing to me.
Oh, I see.
Just grammatically, like I don't care
no, but
about.
See, that's interesting because I actually I sort of like that because it's setting up a very rhythmic way of thinking too.
Sure.
If you know, I don't know, but
I mean,
but
I can find the sentence. It's right here. So, the principle of the statute, comma, be it observed, comma, is, comma, not merely that written contracts shall be signed, comma, but also that all contracts, except those specifically exempted, generally those that are for small amounts and are to remain in force but for a short time, shall be both written and signed.
Right.
So the funny thing is, I feel like you could sum that whole thing up by saying, in order for a contract to be valid, it must be written and signed.
Yes. I think so too. And this is where I'll agree that like his efficiency is maybe not the best. And so actually, so reading his Wikipedia, the reason why I didn't see a law school is because he actually never went to college. Because back then you could become a lawyer by apprenticing. So I guess he did that.
Nice.
And then just set up a law practice.
Cool. So I feel like there's a lot there, and kind of like that paragraph I just read, it can actually be summed up in a pretty easy argument, because I feel like what he does is he addresses sort of every facet of the same argument. But it has to do primarily with the fact that the Constitution cannot reasonably be considered a legally binding document to anyone because nobody has signed it, and it isn't actually an oath to anybody in particular. So none of the people who are representatives of it are representing to anybody in particular.
Yeah, and then he also, I think the two main things for there being consent to it was like the idea that we vote and also we pay taxes, and then he sort of spends a good deal of time explaining why those aren't actually evidence for consent.
Yep.
Yeah, which, I think I do agree with a lot of it, because it's like I read this as, if you're looking at this as from a very logical standpoint, he's on the money. Like, he's not wrong in that, it's like, no, you're right. We never did sign it. Not even,
Nobody signed it.
Nobody signed it. And when, he was giving all these examples of oaths and how they mean nothing. And like, when you naturalize citizens and they come off the boat and they give an oath or whatever, they're not giving an oath to anybody in particular. So that's void because of that. And so, yeah, sure. I see the point. But of course, and I don't know exactly how to articulate this, so maybe we'll figure it out in this episode.
I think we'll get to the bottom of everything here.
Yeah, I agree. But it's this idea that there is a bit of theater to society, right?
Sure.
Of like, and there, because it gets back to this idea of another point that he, and also I feel like, was it Tolstoy that was making, where the representatives are not actually, like, we are not assigning them very specific assignments for what we want them to do, and also we're doing it secretively, right? That was another big point that he made. And so thus, are they really representing us? And like, I see that point, but also like, whenever you abstract, there's going to be a degree of haziness about the domain that you're delegating. I mean,
I think this particular mode of abstracting has a great degree of, like, a lot of haziness built into it already, because it's like what you're talking about, the secret voting system. So if somebody's a representative, and in theory they're supposed to represent their voters, who are their voters? Nobody has any idea. Because we vote in secret.
No, you know what? And this was actually one of the best points I think that I agreed with out of all of it was the secretive point of, like, it is kind of interesting. Like, I get it, and honestly, especially with how contentious things have gotten.
Right, you want to keep it secret. You don't want anybody to know.
Keep it secret. Yeah, but it is true of, like, if you're expecting these people to represent you, you would expect that then you are responsible for their actions. But in doing it secretively, you're taking that responsibility away, which is why I did kind of find it funny that he kept sort of referring to the United States, the people of the United States of America, as like a secretive, murderous band of robbers.
Robbers, I love it.
You love it, yeah. I
Yeah,
know.
it's great.
Yeah,
no, it's true. I mean, the problem is there's a double-edged sword there because open voting would be highly susceptible to coercion. Not that secretive voting isn't already susceptible to coercion, but it would be highly susceptible to coercion. I think it's a problem all the way from the top to the bottom, and we've talked about this before, about people not wanting to take on the liability for their decision-making. Right. And I think that open voting, yes, being susceptible to coercion, but also requires then the voters to take on the liability for, I voted for that. Well, and then it requires it requires liability all the way through the chain.
Right. But the reason that when I read this, and I'm like, yes, you're logically right, but there's something missing. There's a practicality aspect that's missing. I think that's it. And I think it's because it's like, yes, the problem is you can't know all details of every procedure that you're delegating something to at the outset. Yeah.
It's true, but we could have we could simply change a voting system where you just have to sign your name and put your name on your ballot, and that's it. And everybody knows, and it's public.
But that wasn't the only issue that he was making, though. Is he was also making the issue of just the fact that then these people go off and do things that are sort of beyond the scope that we might have thought that we designated authority for them to do. It's just the inherent issue when you say, hey, you go do this thing. And then they're like, okay. And if you don't want them to come back at you with a bunch of questions, they have to do a certain number of deciding of things. So this is the practical issue, because it's like if you were to have a perfect system where you knew a problem. I mean, this is basically what you're doing when you design a computer program, right? It's like you try to map out all the parameters the best you can, but ultimately you just start doing it and figure out all the things that you need to do to put it together. But if you could do that, I just think that it would just be very inconvenient, because there'd just be too many details probably to go through to run the United States and to get all of that delegated so that every person is up to date with what their representatives are doing. I think it's
impossible to get it all the way through.
But that was a point that I felt like a lot of them were making. That's why I'm hitting on it. So I'll stop.
No, I agree with you. I think that there is a practicality issue, but I think that we are far from butting up to as close to, transparency and ethical running of the government as possible. I don't even think we're approaching that in any real way.
Well, we are. I'm not as pessimistic, but I do agree that it could be better.
Well, because the fact that we're trying to do a lot of different things at the same time, because we have elected officials, representatives of various sorts that are trying to do different tasks, and then we have unelected bodies that are also trying to do different tasks.
Bureaucrats.
Right. Yeah, of course. And
bureaucrats. Sorry,
exactly. Yeah. And we have this secretive voting system. And so I think that the problem is there's so much noise in the system, it's impossible to know whether or not the system is even running well. And I feel like he got on this a little bit, but it's a point that I was thinking of. Like the whole voter fraud conversation comes up every election. And some people say there's no evidence of voter fraud, and some people say there's tons of voter fraud. And basically, how would we have any idea?
You're trying to get us kicked off YouTube, aren't you, Antushka?
I'm saying, how would anybody know?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole. Everybody's asking that question.
Like, how would you know whether there is or isn't? And so
that's
then, you're just relying on it. And so then, why do we trust the people who are saying there isn't? more than the people who say there is. Why are we trusting any of this? Like, it doesn't really make sense that you just trust some person on TV who's like, oh, it's all good, don't worry, I got it.
Yeah, you're right.
That makes no sense to me.
No, I mean, anytime somebody says, trust us, we know what we're doing. It's like, I always am a little bit skeptical to a degree. But yeah, anyway, you would get us onto the voter fraud conversation. I don't want to talk about this. Can we use a different example? Okay. It's kind of get indicted over here. Just kidding.
How about that? Is that not suspicious too?
Yeah, I don't know, man.
Yes, you do. Yeah. Anyway, okay, we'll move off it. Secretive voting. So my practical solution is take the bad with the good. We all have to vote with our faces up in the sun and say that's what I voted for.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a degree to that because, I mean, I have this same issue with my program where a lot of evaluations are done anonymously.
Right.
And it is true. It's just whenever you have a system where people can act anonymously, you're going to get Machiavellianism.
Right.
You know? Yeah, it's just going to happen. And honestly, I think, unfortunately, you're going to get cheaters in any system that you create. Yes. So, I mean, this just seems to be a sad truth about biology.
But this system kind of incentivizes cheaters. It gives them free reign.
Yeah, well, that's a little bit of a yeah, so I mean, yeah, he gets pretty spicy towards the end. You want to talk about Nietzsche being spicy? This guy's naming the Rothschilds.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
Although Michael Malice is Jewish, so I assume he's okay with this essay. He's
okay with it.
He's given I mean, you know, by compiling a book that includes it. And I agree, he wasn't anti-Semitic. He was, I mean, it's just sort of sad that that family has become, you know, the representative of it. But there's a lot of the reason being there's a lot of, you know, as they call them, moneylenders. But yeah, he goes off and he does make, I think, points that are good points that I think were and have been addressed to some degree. I guess before we get to the moneylender stuff, like we could talk about some of the voting stuff, you know, because he was, as I said, his two examples for, you know, when he was saying most people bring up the fact that we vote and we pay taxes as examples for how we consent to the Constitution. Mm-hmm. When he's addressing that, voting specifically, he's sort of rebutting he's using the fact that, you know, at that time you had to be 21 years or older, you had to be a man. You probably had, I think you had to be a white man, right? Well, no. Yeah, I think
landowner.
Not anymore, right? But you had to have land. Yeah, because it was 1870, so it was very new. So you had to have land, and then even of this subset, so that was like whatever, 1/5 of the population, and then within that subset, it was even like maybe 2/3 that actually voted,
right?
And within that subset, and even smaller that regularly voted. Right. So the point being that that's not a good reason, right, to say that you consent, but an opposition to that could be that, you know, now 100 plus years later, we have made more strides to that. The voter age, you know, is 18 now, so more people in that sense. Obviously, women can vote and just everything else. So that was just one sort of thought I had when I was reading the point. Just
I think it's a bad argument of his. I think your question is pointing out a big flaw in that argument. I noticed this. I mean, it's easy to get caught up in arguments with this, and I noticed this with a lot of COVID arguments, and that's where I started to notice this problem. But I don't think that even if there was 100% voter participation, that would mean that voting was consent. And so I don't think that arguing that any percentage of the population is vote, I think it's a mistake on his part.
But are you? Yeah, sorry.
Because he's leaving himself open to then there's some argument, well, if you reach some tipping point, then voting becomes consent.
But are you saying that because you're going to go down the argument that we just talked about where it's like you're not able to actually delegate everything with your vote?
It's not about you're not able to actually delegate everything with your vote. I think that participating in a system to the best of your ability in order to make your life as good as you can does not mean that you've consented to that system. That means that that is the system in which you find yourself. And so maybe, like we talked about last time, a system that a government has set up for people that people don't really have an option to opt in or out of, consent is really neither here nor there. But that doesn't mean that they're saying, yes, we support this. They're saying we're trying to do the best we can in a shitty situation.
Well, maybe that's... Yes, I see what you're saying. But
I don't think doing the best you can in a shitty situation means you go like, I'm giving my stamp of approval on this situation.
Right. Well, and this is the thing that he kept talking about, was its tacit understanding or tacit sort of. There's, but, I see what you're saying, but it's just, sorry, were you going to say something?
Do you know Rawls? I think John Rawls. Mm-hmm. No. He developed the idea of social justice. He wrote a book. We could read that one too. That's a kind of an interesting book in the 70s on the idea of social justice. Mm-hmm. And he has an idea that he proposes in it called the veil of ignorance. I think it's actually a really powerful idea. So he's saying if you want to set up a just and ethical society, what you need to do is the people who design the rules of that society need to not know what position they will hold in that society. So the designers of the rules have to be behind a veil of ignorance where they don't know whether they're going to be at the bottom rung or the top or anywhere. Mm-hmm. And they have to design the society not having any idea what status they will have.
Sure. Yeah, I mean...
And that's the only... So the reason I bring that up is he says that's the only way, because he talks a little bit about consent too, that's the only way where you can really treat people as if they've sort of consented to the rules of society. If they've come to an agreement on equal grounds, not knowing where they or anybody else will be in society.
I think that you need a new word then, because it's like we already established last episode that consent just means an agreement, basically. Right, and so that's why I think you are consenting to I do agree with the idea. Well, no, it's just like, what's your definition, right?
It's agreement. It's agreement with both the ability to refuse. Actually, and Spooner talks about this too. It's agreement with the ability to refuse, should you wish, and good or as full understanding as possible of what you are agreeing to.
Okay. So that's the nuance then of.
But the being able to refuse is a big part because we can't really refuse. We can refuse to vote. I mean, so I would say voting is tacit consent of voting.
Yes.
But it's not tacit consent of everything that the U.S. government does.
No, I think I might agree with you on this, actually, because, I mean, this is something that we talked about before where you sort of laughed, but it's true. It's like why I do kind of feel like there should be some part of the world that's like open for people who like just don't want to have anything to do with society. Just go over there.
Right.
And you do your
New
thing.
Hampshire's trying.
New Hampshire, exactly. Because I sort of see what you're saying is like, it's like not like you can just go out into the wilderness. Although back then you kind of could.
There were times where that was easier. Yes.
No, like 100 years ago, like it was like really is kind of a modern thing where there hasn't been an outlands or even just like an ability to go to another country and disappear.
Right, because passports are a relatively recent thing.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I mean, the globalization of the world is like whatever Woodrow Wilson, United Nations, etc.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, I will agree with that definition of consent. Mm-hmm. Then it's true, especially that voting is it's difficult to say that voting is you're consenting to that because you don't really have another option of what to do.
Right.
This is why I was bringing up the idea of assent, because it's like I kind of look at it as similar to the situation with kids, where it's just like there's just some things we have, as a species, over thousands of years, decided that we were going to group together and sort of contort our bodies into this way that we develop cities. Because it's like, that's what I kept meting out. It's like, you're right. It's like as individuals, we probably can't survive in the wild right now. It would be like, some of us could, but it's going to be tough. So I just think that we've all assented to this. And
well, what is assent then? Like, what does it mean to you?
It's basically consenting with it's it's basically not consent, but it's like it's like doing what is good, being told to do the thing that's good for you by a rational being, by a rational being, because that's the idea of what you are as a parent for your kid. You're deciding that, like, yes, even though you might not want to do this, it's like this, we know that this is the best thing for you.
I would argue the government is not a rational being.
No, and I mean, this is, again, we can tie in Goldman's.
Yes.
That's her last name, right?
Yep, Emma Goldman.
Yeah.
What did you think of that one? Just as
I liked it. And I sort of, I see her point, because her point was basically that people were saying that the era that she lived in, which was, she was writing in 1910, was the era of individualism. But in fact, she was saying it's actually the era of the mob,
right?
And is actually restricting and constricting individualism and tyrannizing it. And so I thought, sorry, I'm just flipping through it.
Chapter 16.
Yeah.
So Emma Goldman was a crazy lady.
Yeah,
she was like a terrorist. She tried to assassinate people.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, I know she went to like Lenin and met Lenin at some point and was talking to him.
Right. And she was like appalled.
Apparently, which is interesting. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, she sort of did strike me as like an Ayn Rand type in her.
Right.
Because she
which
was
is
all
interesting because she's a Marxist.
Right. I know. And that's why it's also interesting, her idea of the individualism, because she was very much like, reading that made me think of the objectivism stuff of, she was just touting how the creative force doesn't come from the majority, it comes from individuals, the minority. And the majority is sort of, as I already said, restricting the minority. But it's interesting because there is a paradox, because then you could say that the majority is being sort of manipulated by a powerful minority that is manipulating them, right? To then suppress the upstart minorities that are trying to then overthrow. Yeah. Like, this is why it's like, and she even kind of gets to that point, but I don't feel like she ever really addresses it. And maybe, again, it comes from a practicality issue that I have with all of this. Is just like, she ended the chapter by saying, in other words, the living vital truth of social and economic well-being will become a reality only through the zeal, courage, and non-compromising determination of intelligent minorities, and not through the mass. But again, it's like, what is a group of intelligent minorities when they come together?
I don't know if she's saying this explicitly, but there is a concept that the ultimate minority is the individual.
Yes. But it's like, again, whenever you are thinking about things in abstraction, which is something that we do as humans all the time, you are generalizing groups into one schema for just the sake of. So it's like, I feel like this idea that the anarchists, it feels like, are always trying to get us to do, of just like the respect for the individual, which I'm completely for, honestly. The supremacy of the individual, I suppose you could say, I have a little bit of an issue with. Maybe that's the utilitarian in me. Because it's just, I don't know, there's just, when you're trying to do great, complicated things like we do, you have to talk about people as a group, individuals as a group, and abstract them. So I don't know. Anyway, I'm talking.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that there's a practicality to a lot of these arguments, though, that has to do with, I don't think that any of these people, and maybe I'm wrong, would say that in no circumstances ever should you discuss groups. I think that it has to do with designating social power specifically to groups and what that means and why you're doing it.
But it's like social power, in some sense, is by definition with groups, because a society doesn't exist without
right, but so
a
something
group.
like democracy, where you're saying the majority of people who hold this opinion get to decide that opinion will rule over everybody else's opinion. So like majorities of opinions or of votes or whatever you want to say. But if everybody thinks that marijuana should be illegal, or 89% of people think, or 51%, or whatever, then they get to impose through power their opinions on everybody else.
Yeah.
I think that's the problem.
No, I mean, yes, but it's naive to me to think that you could ever have a society where that's not the case to some degree.
Well, but it's not always majority rule, because it's like Curtis Yarvin, the whole monarchist thing. There's power can stem from different places, and you can have a system where in democracy we're actually forced to all be governors of each other to an extent and fight each other. So the masses are all fighting each other for their ideas to win, because your neighbor wants their ideas to win, and so you have to beat him at the polling booth or whatever. Versus a king, the king takes on the role of making all the rules, and the king takes on all the liability. Because if the king is too tyrannical, probably the people will cut off his head or something like that. Not always, but it has to do with what your role is. And so in democracy, your role is to try and be a tyrant against everybody else in society. In a mass.
No. I mean, yeah, that's what Spooner's saying, right?
Right. And Goldman. I feel like it's kind of what they're all saying to a point.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know.
Because they all use terms that discuss group, like Goldman talks about artists. I don't think that you would argue that you should not use terms that group people in any circumstance.
Well, the reason I think that I keep going back to this, though, is maybe because of the conversation we had where you had an issue with, I guess you could say, anthropomorphizing groups.
Yes.
Yeah, because and that's where I do feel like they do have an issue with that.
Yeah, probably.
And that's why I kept going on that point of like, yes, but it's not possible to delegate, again, as we already said, everything that you need.
Right, but it is possible to not say things like China is at war with Tibet or something like that, because that is a very strange statement. It's like this particular leader of China has decided to use a whole bunch of people and go kill people over there. And treating it at the personal level like that, I think forces you, the reason I think that's important is that forces you to see the actual decisions that are being made and who is making those decisions. Like, the UK doesn't call France. The Prime Minister of the UK might call the Prime Minister of France.
Yeah, but it's, again, we're talking practical, from the practical
But I don't even think it's practical to say, like, the UK has imposed sanctions on France. It's the Prime Minister of the UK has decided to do something that will disallow the people of the UK from paying normal amounts of money to the people of France.
No, I mean, in the case of sanctions, those are pretty sure. I mean, it just depends on what you're doing, right? But I see what your point is, right? You're saying that everybody in England didn't decide to put sanctions on, right?
Right.
That's your point, right? Yes.
Right.
But again,
that somebody did, or some group of people did.
Yes. No, but we delegated the power for that individual to decide when they saw fit to do sanctions. Because
I think it's fine as long as you say the next step is...
well, hang on, you didn't let me finish. Because it's not practical, right? Because it's not practical for all of us on a time scale to decide that we should do sanctions. At least it wasn't at the time that governments were invented, right?
Right.
It's like, this is the other thing you have to think about is for the entirety of human civilization until basically now, it was really difficult to communicate over long distances. So you had to delegate this kind of stuff to representatives because you just couldn't call somebody. So it's like, maybe now we could have the conversation about, like maybe we should think about having like a sanction vote, right? Like, do we think that we should do sanctions? And everybody, and more like, but again, then more people, that's going to take more time out of people's day. And that's going to piss some people off, as people are already pissed off about the fact that they have to go vote once every year, So that's my point, though, is that's why I keep going back to the practical point.
Yeah, but I don't think so. Okay, so here's where it unravels for me, is I don't think sanctions are ever ethical. Sanctions or treaties or anything like that. So I wouldn't say that there should be votes on whether or not we do sanctions. Right. I think that the entire thing is it is a narrative that is giving people ungodly amounts of power in tyrannical and very harmful ways.
So this is why I was asking last episode, and why I think it would be helpful for me to know more about like these people that we're reading. What is the society that you and like them foresee? Mm-hmm. Like, because it's true. It's like all of these things I can agree. It's like it would be nice if we didn't have them. It's just I don't think that we can get rid of that, and still have the society we have.
Yeah. I think that that's possible. So, in the short term, what I would love to see is a situation where instead of saying, where the U.S. places sanctions on Canada, that doesn't mean that like some vague narrative of all the U.S. people have like kind of agreed to do this. That means that whoever is president or in Congress or whatever at the time, fine, that's the decision they make. They take on the liability for that decision. So if that ends up costing a bunch of people money, they owe people money. If that ends up costing a bunch of people lives, they owe people lives, and they need to figure out how to deal with that. So in the short term, I would love to see a situation where maybe we keep our government, but people actually have liability for their decision making. And in the long term, I would love to see a situation where we as a people can figure out how to take on enough personal responsibility that we need very, very little governing.
Yeah.
It's but just, that doesn't happen tomorrow. That requires a lot.
No, and it just is a question of, I don't know how much of today's society you could have without specialization and thereby delegation, right? It's like,
well, I'm not talking about general specialization or general. I'm talking about
governing. But I think you are when you talk about having people governing themselves more, because that's what I'm saying is, as you increase individualism, you decrease the collective, and I think and it requires collectivism to do very complicated and grand things on a large scale.
I think it requires
make a nuclear bomb, like making a silicon chip, like making an airplane,
right?
Like doing all the procedures that we do, in the hospitals and stuff. It requires a tremendous amount of infrastructure and a tremendous amount of different jobs of people just being very good at one specific thing, and thus lots of delegation of duties without people understanding what they're delegating.
Yes. But I'm not talking about that. All of that stuff exists fine without a government.
How do you know that?
Because most of the stuff you just listed started before governments had anything to do with any of these things.
The hospitals? No.
Hospitals
the nuclear
didn't start,
bomb and
government
whatnot?
Started hospitals? Aren't hospitals really old?
It's like no. Hospitals, this is what Foucault talks about, though, is, the idea of a hospital general is a pretty new thing that popped up in the Enlightenment at the end or maybe end of Middle Ages, and probably was like leper colonies were the precursor to them.
Sure.
So I'm not saying that like some sort of collection of that, but I'm saying as hospitals as we know it today with the technology that runs them, I think is absolutely requires
a government.
A government, yes.
Okay, so Thomas Sowell has has a good little like quote that I like. Mm-hmm. That is, "What's your starting point and why?" And he uses it for OSHA.
See, I want what's your end point?
Like, what?
I want what's your end point. That's what I keep asking about. Well, like, what's the society end point?
But so he uses it for OSHA because people argue once OSHA came in, workplace safety got better.
Yeah.
And he's like, yeah, but if you roll back the clock before OSHA, it was already getting better. So how can you say it was OSHA that did it? How do you know it wasn't going to keep going?
Well, my question is, did the indicator before and after OSHA came change?
No.
How you're measuring?
Not really. It was
not really?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay. Anyway, so that's his example. But
okay.
So with airplanes, for example, somebodies start developing a technology, and eventually, this is, I would say, usually the course of things. Eventually, a government decides to get involved in some way. And the cynical side of me says probably because there's money to be made there.
Yeah.
But I don't think it requires a government to do any of these things you're talking about. I don't think a government, because the thing is, you can start a company.
Here's my point. You can say that, but we haven't ran that experiment yet. And so, yes, maybe you're right, but we don't have anywhere.
I think we run that experiment all the time with most things in our society.
But they all exist within an infrastructure of a government, which is why it's not a fair experiment.
I guess. But like the shoes example. There are shoe companies that make shoes,
it's all
right?
contaminated with government. It's like it's all contaminated with government.
Yeah, but there were shoes before the government had anything to do with anything like that. Yes, but to start a
company, you have to make an LLC. You have to start. There's all sorts of.
No. But there were shoemakers 400 years ago.
Yes.
Before the U.S. government.
Yes.
There were people in Native American tribes making clothes.
Again, okay, so sorry. I didn't mean to get hung up on the shoe example because we sort of talked about this last episode. Yeah. I agree that, yes, you're going to have shoemakers that probably would exist even in a decentralized system. I'm not talking about that kind of stuff.
Right.
I'm talking about
higher order.
Yes, the higher order technologies that we, like automobiles and things like that. It's like, think of how complicated a factory that puts together cars is. And yes, and you're saying, yes, a cobblers did exist, but those were artisans,
I just don't see any barrier to something starting a complicated factory without a government.
Well, it's the idea that the factory is in essence in opposition to anarchy because it's a group of organized individuals that are sort of they're allowing themselves to become automatons to exist in a process.
But I'm not against cooperation. I'm not against hierarchical systems. I'm not against anything
as long as
like
it's
that.
Consented.
Exactly. Yes.
Gotcha. Okay.
And I personally believe, and maybe you disagree, that I think that most of these things are very possible without government as we think of government.
I just think because then it gets like, yes, I see. You can say, well, then what is consent? And you say we already established that, and then plus the idea that you also have an ability to go off and do something else. Right. And okay, I think I can agree with that as that being a basis. Because actually, I was also trying to kind of rethink whether, how. Because that was, I was making a big sticking point about that as the fundamental to the argument.
Right.
Because of the issue that, as I already said, of there's a consciousness aspect where you can't really know, what people think. But I don't know. I have to think about this more. And I guess I just, I'm wondering if I was wrong, Antushka.
Well,
dare I say?
I don't know. Here's the thing. I very much understand the pressing on this. How would we exist without government? Because I think that there are things that might be harder to exist without government. And I go back to the Milton Friedman example where he lists the functions of government. And one of the functions of government is to fund and create things that there wouldn't necessarily be any market for without them. And I think that his hedge on it is an important one that it's actually sort of difficult to think about what that might be. Because most things that are things that people want there to be.
Yes, right. It's an unknown.
I mean, it's kind of like a weird thing to say, but it's not like people do want hospitals.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if they do, and this
yeah,
is the
maybe
thing
not.
Is,
yeah.
Well, and like the funny thing is, I bring all these up more as just again for philosophical discussion because it's like I don't know how I don't feel like the hospital is a perfect institution. You know, it's like it's definitely. Whether a perfect society would exist and have that as the sort of mainstay for where medical treatment occurs.
Sure.
I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but it's just, I think laying out, when you're talking about how you want to govern society, I think you have to talk about what society is going to look like.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing I feel like is lacking with a lot of the things that we're reading. But it could just be they've probably written about this and we just haven't read it. You know what I mean?
Well, I think there tends to be a lot of openness about there isn't what it's not utopian, and that's like the important bit about that is that we're not saying what it will look like.
Right.
It doesn't matter. That's up to people.
Well, yes, I see what you're saying. You're saying put these parameters in place and then let the society that happens happen.
Right.
Yeah. Look at you. Look at you. Yeah.
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 It's tricky. It's scary, though. I mean,
is.
the thing is, even to me, the idea of eliminating the U.S. government tomorrow is a terrifying idea.
Well, you know, it's interesting because there's a lot of things that are terrifying when you talk about changing fundamental structures of society, obviously. Because it's like there's so many things that require somebody just looking at them. I mean, we talked, everybody learned this during the pandemic, the essential worker. It's like there's just some jobs that are required for society, the wheels to turn. Uh-huh. And how do you unwind those gears? I mean, I don't know. There are ways, but
I mean, I think a lot of them are already unwound. The funny thing that most people also don't think about is most functions of the government involve just paying companies that are doing it already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, like the electric company, the electricity is on. Yes, that company is highly subsidized by the government, but that's a company that the government is paying.
Right.
And so we could also just pay them.
We could. It's true. No, and yeah, I mean, so I think it was interesting to sort of think about like the time that Lysander Spooner and Emma Goldman were writing Lysander Spooner in 1870. So the Civil War had just happened, and they were in the midst of Reconstruction and the payment of the debts of the war, which is why I thought the end when he was sort of going on to the moneylender talk was very interesting, because it's like, there are some points that are, I think, that were being made that it's interesting. You still see those points being made today, which is why I think there's a valid concern, like with Ukraine, of just how we're loaning all this money and then we're also now buying up, I guess, farmland there. And so it's the same idea that back in the day, and he's just looking at the Civil War from an interesting perspective of like it was sort of northern lenders were trying to get hold of the southern markets and then basically used, the freeing of the blacks to help them overthrow the South and their dominion and then take control. And by doing that, they loan money to the U.S. government, and then now that they won, now the U.S. government has to pay them back. Mm-hmm. And they do that by exploiting the masses through taxes.
Right.
And so, I think there's, and then you just had, 500,000 people die, right? And you had a lot of wars. You had the Napoleonic Wars. So it's obvious that and he makes this point that in all the cases, everybody's just sort of exploiting the bottom line. Emma Goldman makes this point too, of like, the problem is, with the money lenders is it's just, what's the best loan that you're going to get is a loan to a government, because they're most likely going to pay it back. You can charge high interest because, you know, they have the monopoly of violence and can extort people. Mm-hmm. So it just kind of makes sense from an economic standpoint, which I think is fair of him to sort of point out of like, right. We made this scenario happen. And so this is also where you could get at, and I kind of agree, is like maybe none of this would happen if you just didn't have people grouping up, in masses and then, organizing themselves under the banner head of one king or one right. president or whatever. But I don't know, because I also am sort of, he was making that idea as if the moneylenders and the kings were the responsible ones for the wars. But there's also a question, and Emma Goldman kind of puts this point of like some responsibility of the masses for a type of power that is sort of ephemeral, but nonetheless is like maybe there is this war spirit in us, and we would be killing each other regardless of whether regardless of what king was at the head. Right. So I think those are some important questions to be asking too. And I think you're sort of getting at it of like, what's our natural inclination too? You're saying like, put these parameters into place, maybe we'll naturally go towards a different society. But one could argue that this is the natural
absolutely
state. It's like I don't really subscribe to the idea that anybody is any group is calculated enough to control the trajectory of humankind, and we really have just gotten to this state based off of randomness and stuff. Okay, I'm done ranting. Thank you. I see.
I think that's that's entirely possible. I think it's an important point that we are where we are, and who's to say that it's not natural? Yeah. Absolutely. Right. That's why I'm saying that I think doing it tomorrow doesn't work. What I would love to see long term is a society where people are able to develop enough personal responsibility. I mean, me included, I don't have anywhere near enough personal responsibility. I'm like, I love the idea of personal responsibility, but I mean, I think most people in modern society have no idea what it would mean to be self-governed. But they do too. I mean, I think we all have an idea, but...
Yeah. I don't know. I think you're right. But again, it's just this question of why are we like this? Maybe we don't want to be self-governed, and maybe that's why we've evolved to have this. Because no other nation, no other species has a government, right? Other than there's primitive groups that have been studied in like chimpanzees and stuff. Is like there is an idea that there are structures and societies and stuff. But yes, and is that all a government is? I guess maybe is that all a government is? So maybe they do have governments.
I don't know. I mean, what's funny is it makes me think of the Old Testament again, and the idea why are we like this? Because of sin. And because there's this funny thing where at first the way that God sets up Israel is they don't have a king. Mm-hmm. And they just like can't get their shit together, and they keep messing up. And so they ask God for a king, and he's like, I guess if you need one, and he gives them kings.
Right.
And then it kind of helps them to see to keep their vision on what they're supposed to be looking at and not.
Yeah, no, I think we do maybe not kings. So
no, they weren't democracies for sure.
Well, no, but and this is what I say is like I don't know if we necessarily need like kings and queens in the ancient sense, but like in terms of having people that we sort of hold up as idyllic symbols, I think does seem to be a very inherent aspect of us, which again I think has to do with the fact of how we just conceptualize society. It's easy for us to remember a virtuous person if we just associate one person with all of those virtues.
Right.
It's just a memory schema, I think, which is why, again, I always go back and think you have to look at consciousness as this, because you're talking about, the original sin stuff, and it just feels like that all comes from the idea that, it's like no other animal, it seems, reflects upon itself as deeply as we do.
But that's where sin even comes from in the Bible.
Right.
They eat of the tree of knowledge of good and
exactly.
evil.
Yes,
they get knowledge. That's like where sin is.
Yes, and we talked about that. It's and how I've thought, or people think, and I certainly subscribe, like the Bible's just consciousness, like us coming to consciousness and stuff like that. Right. Yeah. There were. Let me just make sure. I feel like there were some other points.
Well, what about Goldman? What if we shift our focus to Goldman a little bit? Because she talks a lot about artists and quality and kind of like lowest common denominator art and things like that. Because the whole time I was reading her, I was reflecting on what I've been doing with music lately and feeling like a massive schmuck.
Conform, because you feel like you're conforming and stuff like that, and not really being
an artist. But then at the same time, to be an artist is like kind of it's a very weird thing to do. But her point about Michelangelo, and with whoever hired him to paint the ceiling of the chapel, was hiring Michelangelo to do what Michelangelo does. They weren't like hiring him to do the hits and paint a flower and then a really nice fruit bowl and stuff. It was up to him as the artist to express himself as he felt was important for that building.
Yeah, well, no, it's interesting that you say that, because it's also when she was talking about, like, on the same note, like the good writers, and she was mentioning Thoreau. Mm-hmm. And, it's like, educators of Farrer's type are nowhere tolerated, while the dietitians of pre-digested food, a la Professors Eliot and Butler, are the successful perpetrators of an age of non-entities and automatons. And so, talking about how Humphrey Ward's, Clyde Fitch's are the idols of the masses, while but few know or appreciate the beauty and genius of an Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, or Ibsen. So it's actually interesting, because it's like, I haven't heard of any of the popular people that she lists.
Right, same. Yeah, they have no staying power.
So that's, I guess, my point, though, is, and I guess that would be to her point, that, it's like, there's a reason we haven't heard of them, because they are just the candy of the masses. And that's a little bit encouraging to me, too, because it just goes to show that, it's like, don't worry about it. I mean, I guess it sucks in a sense, because, you probably won't be appreciated if you're a great artist.
But if you're undeniable, you're undeniable. Yeah,
and then if you're a great artist, also, you shouldn't really care about whether your stuff is appreciated.
Yep.
So anyway, that's what I would say to you, Mr. Antushka. Yeah.
I liked her bit about the nation of cowards also. That one. Felt strong.
Well, that's felt very Spooner-esque, because it's the same thing of how we're anonymous. There's like safety and anonymity of the masses, or safety in the anonymity of the voting, right? And I thought her just point, though, of the power of public opinion in democracy. She was saying, like, Wendell Phillips made this point too 50 years before her.
Right. That's I think that's the mass of cowards one too.
Right. It's not only omnipotent but omnipresent. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. And because there is this tacit understanding, and this is what I was getting at, that we are able to generate a better truth in aggregate than in isolation. But I think the problem is it depends on the type of truth that we're trying to get at.
Right.
And I don't know if we have time to tease that out.
I don't know. But the other point that I thought was an interesting one is when she's talking about how sort of everybody has become a socialist, including sort of the rich overlords. Which feels very true today. I mean, you think about the wealthiest CEOs in the country, they're like really left wing, and it's bizarre.
Right.
And they I guess they think of themselves as like the saviors of the masses or something weird.
Yeah. Well, and that's also interesting because it was different 50 years ago. There was more, and so that was 50 years after she was writing. Right. So maybe it is just oscillatory,
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, because now that the idea has become a popular slogan, almost everyone is a socialist today. The rich man as well as his poor victim. The upholders of law and authority as well as their unfortunate culprits. The free thinker as well as the perpetuator of religious falsehoods. The fashionable lady as well as the shirtwaist girl.
Mm-hmm.
It's all. But I feel like it has to do with that the sifting out, and so it's just like how everybody listens to Spotify now, and everybody listens to the same garbage, and it's you go to the grocery store, and every radio station plays the same stuff. It's just like it's all coalescing into whatever the majority wants, probably through market forces or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, and that's, I guess that's really the ultimate issue that she was pointing out to, I would say, is the fact that market forces, and this is what Lysander Spooner was pointing out as well, it's the fact that market forces are the things that are determining power, and what is, not power, determining, at least in Goldman's view, the things that people think are good.
Right.
I was saying the power thing because, Spooner was making that point of how money basically is that's how you get power.
Right.
Because you can buy armies, and then you can exploit people, and you can generate more revenue that way.
Yep.
And, he was quoting Caesar as saying, the same thing. So I don't know. I mean, that's why it also just these writings feel like a little bit of a critique of capitalism too.
Yeah, well, both Emma Goldman and Lysander Spooner are on the left too.
Right, but it's just interesting that you do have you sort of mentioned this before. Like you have a contingent of anarchists that are like from the libertarian standpoint.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I guess I just kind of assumed that you had to, like on a spectrum, anarchy was almost like the far end of libertarianism.
Uh-huh.
Does anybody think about it like that?
Yeah, I think so. However, a lot of Marxists call themselves anarchists too.
I know. So that doesn't really make sense to me. Does that make sense to you?
I mean, I think, yes. In terms of, at its baseline, I think Marxist is an anarchist ideology in that the true communist society should have no leaders because there is no ownership.
Right.
And so everything should be shared. Nobody should have any more power than anybody else.
Oh, yes, that's right. Which is why I said, well, that's basically sounds like a hunter-gatherer society.
Yeah, I mean, theirs is definitely a back to the agrarian lifestyle.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
No. But then we had this exact conversation. Because then I said, well, no, but this hunter-gatherer predates agrarian.
Sure.
It's like,
you're right. So they need to take their idea further.
Yes, yeah. Because it's like the true equality was the wandering nomadic tribe, which, I mean, maybe this is what people are saying is like, and this is why Nietzsche keeps calling us a sick animal, because it's like maybe we have gotten ourselves into this mess of consciousness. Because I'm actually, the more I'm thinking about this and the more we talk and I read and everything, the more I'm thinking like consciousness actually maybe seems like it is, you need, like it wouldn't just happen in the wild. Like you need culture and society.
Or you need to be God in order to deal with it, bro.
Or you need God, but you need education because you need like to be taught. Right. And so that's why it's like I do think there's been a gradual increase in the consciousness of humanity over time because we've just taught the preceding generations to be more and more self-aware and how to do that. And, you do that by focusing on teaching them language at a specific period. Now we know the exact period where we need to teach them language. Like, we've got everything refined over thousands of years, how to cultivate this thing called consciousness.
Right.
And I think, that just, it begs a very good question of, well, some people want us to stop, but it's the question of, have we gone too far? Can we reverse it at this point? Because I think maybe that's what I'm also getting at, is when you guys talk about wanting to dissemble society to go back to this.
I don't want to go back to agrarian. That's not me.
But I'm saying I feel like you do. I think that's the logical end of what you're proposing.
I don't think it has to be. This is what we talked about before. I think that it's like what we were saying. I think somebody could start a factory all they wanted.
Yeah.
I think all of these things are possible. I think that,
all right. You're right. We have talked about this. I just think that experiment hasn't been done. Maybe it should be done.
I think it's been done in ways to show that it is possible. Like the Old West, I think, is my favorite example. But 14th century Finland is another good one.
I know. Yeah.
There's also old sections of Italy. There's
right. The Renaissance Italy, but even Renaissance Italy had a government, and
but not all parts of it did.
Okay.
There were things that weren't states. Okay. There were like territories that were uncontrolled and
they were uncontrolled, or were they controlled by Medici-like families?
No, they were not. They were ungoverned. They were not controlled by that at all.
All right.
And so then the argument against that is, by there being borders of areas that are not controlled, they are controlled.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. So it's never been run on a global scale.
Well, no, and that is where I would also be like, yes, like that limitation of the experiment, I would be like, okay, sure, but it's good enough, of like, where if you carved out Alaska for just you, I'm not saying we would do this, Alaska, right. So, but
don't worry, Alaska, example, relax.
You're okay. Well, let's say we just said, okay, if you want to live in an anarchic society, go to Alaska, live with the grizzlies, do whatever you want.
I mean, probably
just leave us alone.
The territory of Alaska before it was a state was pretty anarchic.
Right. Yes, of course. But I'm just saying, sure, you could say that, and then to say that, the fact that we're confining to that spot is a type of control, sure, but you're still able to create the conditions where you're able to do it. And fine, I guess that's your point about Italy too, but I don't know. Okay, maybe it works. Who knows?
I think it's very difficult. I think it requires a lot of personal responsibility and a lot of cooperation.
Well, and you know what I think always ends up getting people to ultimately aggregate and put their auspices or their delegation under one head is a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's always just like I bet you even that anarchic region in Italy probably aggregated when they were being, persecuted by the Catholics or whatever, or the Holy Roman Empire or something like that.
I think crisis is good. I think the U.S. government gets people to cooperate by sort of forcing them at threat of violence. I think that paying people is another good way to get people to cooperate with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The carrot or the stick.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
I mean, it's this thing, actually. The funny thing is, I was talking with my wife at one point we were reading about progressivism and fascism as opposed to Marxism and communism. And that progressivism and fascism are both very carrot-oriented in the way they lay out their ideology and how they'll get people to do things.
Fascism is carrot-oriented too?
In a way where you get people to believe that what they're doing is helpful for the state and they are rewarded.
Morally, they're in the moral right or whatever.
Right. Versus, like, beat people or kill them into submission.
Mm.
I mean, they both probably work to a degree.
Yeah, but I guess I would say you have fascist regimes, obviously, that do that. So I don't know. Like, if you were making an analogy, I would have thought that the second part of that, you would have brought up another type of government that exerts control through beating them. But I might not be understanding what you're saying.
Well, I guess, like, monarchies do a lot of beating.
Okay. So, okay, there we go.
I think dictatorship, things like that. Yeah. There's a lot of beating that goes on in those.
Sure. Okay.
Off with their head.
Yeah. Let them eat cake.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I'm going to edit this one a lot, I think.
Are you?
Yeah.
Really? I think it's been a good one.
You think so? Okay.
You don't like it?
No, it's fine. Sometimes
I'm a little worried that the next one's going to be the same.
I am a little worried about that too. Do you think? I guess it. Well, no, I mean, but at the same time, I thought you said the Rothbard one.
I mean, that's really good, right? That's like a pinnacle piece. It's good to read it. The
we should
Anatomy
definitely
of the State, but
yeah,
I feel like we should have read that first.
Mm-hmm.
He makes a lot of good points. He talks about treaties. He talks about sanctions.
Is this David Friedman, the New York Times op-ed?
I believe so. I think it's Milton Friedman's son.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, is he Milton Friedman's son? I didn't know that.
Is that right or wrong?
Well, there could be. I guess there could be two David Friedmans, but I'm pretty sure there's a David Friedman that's a New York Times op-ed writer who's also an economist, and so that would make sense if he's also Milton Friedman's son.
But I don't know about that.
Okay.
That it feels a little too like neat to be true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is the New York Times guy though. I'm surprised that Michael Malice had a article of him though. Are you looking David Friedman up?
I am. I don't see anything about Milton, so maybe I'm just wrong about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, anyway.
Is it the op-ed guy, though?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, okay, well, so I'm down. We'll do that, and
Malice?
Well, didn't we already do Malice?
No, he's got his own chapter at the end.
No, okay. Oh, I read it though. I guess I thought.
Oh, okay, sure.
But it's fine.
It, but it's like
it's like exactly so.
I mean, we can do David Friedman if you want, but the Anatomy of the State is kind of long.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, the Spooner one was 50 pages, so Friedman and Rothbard together is, I think, 50 pages.
Okay, well, let's do that. Let's do it.
And if you don't, one person doesn't get through, it's fine. I almost actually didn't get through this week.
The Spooner one? Yeah, it was tough. It was long.
Well, I finished the Spooner one, and then I had to finish the Goldman one today. But yeah, I didn't realize it was, even though we said it last week, I think, I forgot. I thought it was 30 pages.
Right.
But it was cool. Like I said, I felt like it was easier to read because I was able to see the structure. So I will say I sort of glossed over it because I was like, okay, so now he's just going through the different examples of like, this
same.
Is why.
There were all those chapters, the like short ones. There was like, it's just another version of the same argument.
Right. Yes. This is why the Navy
IRS.
oaths, the IRS. Yeah. This is why the IRS is void.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I don't know. I mean, that's the thing is there's a part of me that is certainly empathetic. No, it's not that, or what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. I can see the appeal of it. But I think it still does come to this practical. Maybe that's the new sticking point that I'm going with this episode.
Right.
Cool.
The practical sticking point.
Yeah.
We need a good title to get people to listen because nobody listened to the last one.
Yeah. Although I mean, it was still more than like even though it wasn't as many. Yeah, but that's better than it was like. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I look at the bright side.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we gotta think of what the people want to listen to, or not. Who cares? That's what I say.
I think who cares is the right idea. We just got to get him to listen.
Yeah. No, I mean, no, I think whatever you're doing is good. I think if you're down with continuing to do that.
I'll just keep it up. Yep.
I think it's been helping.
And we need another book.
Yes. Should we start thinking about that?
Yes.
Yeah, because I mean, I have a few ideas, but I mean, I almost have too many ideas.
Yeah.
Because here, let me just grab them real quick.
Yeah.
So, I got these books, Dioscorides on Pharmacy and Medicine.
Okay.
So this might be an interesting one, and also Pliny the Elder. One of these two might be interesting.
Yeah.
I had gotten these actually based off of when we were reading the chemical book, the chemistry book, because they were talking about these guys. Pliny the Elder was one of the encyclopedists that they talk about.
Yeah.
And I mean, so this Dioscorides one, I'm holding it up. I don't know if you can see it. Dioscorides on Pharmacy and Medicine by John M. Riddle.
How do you spell it? D-S...
Yeah, it's Dio, like Ronnie James Dio.
Nice. Holy diver.
Yeah, Scorides, Scorides. I'm not pronouncing it correctly.
I-D-E-S.
On Pharmacy and Medicine. So it's a book about him where this historian basically writes about him. So it might be a good book just because it actually answers, as I was reading it, I was like, this answers a lot of the questions that you had in the first or the second episode we had about just like, what did a doctor look like back in the day? I mean, this is specifically talking about ancient Rome, but it was kind of interesting. And it goes through, because Dioscorides basically wrote a treatise that was used, it was like a pharmacopoeia that was used by many people back in the day. Okay. So just documenting all the sorts of different herbal remedies and medicines that a Roman physician would use. And so he just goes through it and is talking about all the different types of medicines that they had, which is kind of interesting. And they had cancer treatments and stuff that some of the same things that we had today, that from isolating from like plants and whatnot. So
cool.
So that's one idea. Pliny the Elder is also just interesting. This is actually his writing, so it would be reading a guy from like a Roman,
really old.
And we could just pick parts that are just kind of interesting, but I don't know. It's an encyclopedia, so it's just he picks stuff and then he just writes about like what they knew about it at that time. So it's kind of interesting from that standpoint, but I don't know how great of radio it would make.
Well, I don't know. I think that's pretty cool. But let's do the first one. I mean, we can just keep doing. We'll get through tons of books if we just keep doing this.
Yeah. Okay, so I agree. I think the Dioscorides one will.
All right, and it's by Riddle. Is that right?
John M. Riddle.
All right, I got it. Cool.
I hope it's not too expensive.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah, I think I it's not for me. Not the way I get it.
Sweet.
All right.
Cool. All right.
We did it.
Gig stuff?
I mean, just gigs. Playing an Armadillo Den for the first time this weekend. I'm excited about that.
Oh, nice.
It's a big venue in South Austin.
Yeah. There used to be, that's funny, because there used to be, is that related to it was like the Armadillo capital of the world? There was some famous spot that like Willie Nelson and like Blaze Foley and all those outlaw country guys would play at in Austin.
Maybe it could be.
And it had armadillo. It was like the world capital of world headquarters of armadillos or something like that.
Maybe.
There's a bar.
I'll see if there's a bunch of Willie Nelson stuff there.
So this is in Austin?
Yeah, but I haven't played there before.
Well, that's awesome. And it's a kind of a big deal then, you said?
Yeah, I'm excited about this gig. Yeah.
It's a Saturday night gig?
Yep.
Wow. And it's with your band?
It's with Carly Wascom's band. I'm playing guitar for her. But
well, that's
great.
cool.
Yeah, she's a badass singer from Louisiana. I think we've talked about her.
No, okay. Have you played with her before?
Yeah. I'm like her regular guitar player.
Oh, cool. I'm not familiar.
Yeah.
Nice. And Are you still doing that residency thing, or you have like?
Oh no, that was just July.
Okay.
Maybe I'll get another one, but
that's cool. Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Sweet. All right.
Cool. Oh yeah. You probably got to go. All right. See ya.
Talk to you later.
See ya.
Stop that.